What if the person sworn to protect you was the one you needed protection from? For over 22 decades, Stephanie Lazarus lived a double life. By day, a respected Los Angeles Police Department detective specializing in art theft, trusted by her colleagues, praised for her professionalism. But behind that polished badge and polite smile, she was hiding a deadly secret, one that started with a broken heart and ended with a brutal murder. In February 2025, her name was back in the headlines again. At 64 years old, after more than a decade in prison, Lazarus stood before a parole board for the second time and was denied again. The reason? Even now, decades later, her story doesn't quite match the evidence. This is the story of how a decorated LAPD detective thought she had committed the perfect crime, stayed hidden in plain sight for 23 years, and was finally brought down by one small clue preserved in a freezer. Welcome to Death Row Diaries, and today we're diving deep into one of the most jaw-dropping cases in law enforcement history. The shocking fall of Stephanie Lazarus. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stephanie Eileen Lazarus was not the type of person anyone would suspect of murder. At least, not at first glance. She had joined the Los Angeles Police Department in the early 1980s, a time when women in the force still had to fight to be taken seriously. Lazarus was smart, ambitious, and had a reputation for being determined. She didn't work in a flashy division at first, but she climbed steadily, eventually landing a prestigious role as an art theft investigator. Her personal life, though, was much more complicated. While attending UCLA between 1978 and 1982, she met a young man named John Rutan. He was tall, athletic, charming, the kind of guy who turned heads. For Lazarus, it was more than just a college fling. She fell hard. They dated for years, and even after John moved on, Stephanie's attachment didn't fade. And that was the problem. By 1985, John had met someone new. Sherry Rasmussen wasn't just pretty, she was accomplished. At 29, she was the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. She was warm, confident, and deeply in love with John. They got engaged quickly, and by November 1985, they were married. For most people, that would be the end of a love triangle. For Stephanie Lazarus, it was the beginning of something much darker. Friends and family would later testify that Lazarus wasn't shy about expressing her feelings. She allegedly showed up at the hospital where Sherry worked, pulled her aside, and delivered a chilling warning. "If I can't have John, nobody will." At the time, it sounded like bitter jealousy. In hindsight, it was a threat, one Sherry's parents would never forget. Still, Sherry tried to brush it off. She told her parents about the encounter, and while they were concerned, they had no idea just how serious it would become. Stephanie, on the other hand, kept up appearances. She continued working cases at LAPD, hanging out with friends, and, on the surface, living a normal life. But beneath the badge, resentment was simmering. February 24, 1986, was an unusually quiet day for Sherri Rasmussen. Her husband John had gone to work that morning, leaving her at their Van Nuys condo. She had mentioned feeling uneasy about a recent string of burglaries in the neighborhood. LAPD's theory was that two Latino men had been hitting homes nearby. It was on everyone's mind. When John came home that later evening, he walked into a nightmare. Inside the condo, the scene was chaos. Furniture overturned, glass shattered, signs of a violent struggle everywhere. Sherry's body was on the living room floor. She had been beaten severely, bitten, and shot 3 times with a .38 caliber revolver. Her BMW was missing. Detectives quickly zeroed in on the burglary theory. It fit the profile. Sort of. A stolen car, signs of forced entry, valuable electronics gone. But the level of violence seemed personal. The strange thing, even in those first days, some people, including Sherry's own family, were suspicious. Nels Rasmussen, Sherry's father, immediately brought up Stephanie Lazarus's name. He told police about the threat, about the history with John, and about how uncomfortable Sherry had been with her. But LAPD brushed it aside. Lazarus was one of their own. She had no criminal record, no reason to be on their suspect list. Besides, they had 2 burglars to catch. The case file would later show that while her name was mentioned early, no serious follow-up was done. No interviews, no alibi checks, no search warrants, just a note in the file. And then, nothing. After weeks turned into months, and months into years, the Sherry Rasmussen murder case went cold. The so-called burglary suspects were never caught. Evidence sat in storage, untested, untouched. And life moved on, for most people. For Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, life didn't move on at all. They lost their daughter in the most violent way imaginable, and they were left with a gnawing feeling that justice hadn't been done. They never stopped bringing up Stephanie Lazarus's name to anyone who would listen. Every time they spoke to police, they reminded them about the threat, about the motive. Still, nothing happened. Meanwhile, Stephanie's career flourished. She joined specialized units, became well-liked among her peers, and eventually landed a coveted spot investigating art theft, a niche, high-profile assignment. She even started her own side business, Unique Investigations, a private investigation firm. On the outside, she looked like a model officer, respected, accomplished, and far removed from the bloody crime scene in Van Nuys. But the truth was sitting in an evidence freezer, waiting for the right moment. It was 2004 when the first crack in Stephanie Lazarus's armor appeared. Cold case detectives, armed with better forensic technology, decided to reopen the Rasmussen file. Among the preserved evidence was something overlooked for years, a swab from a bite mark found on Sherry's arm. Back in 1986, DNA profiling was in its infancy. That bite mark sample had been collected, labeled, and stored, but never fully analyzed. Now, with modern testing, it told a different story. The DNA was female. That instantly changed the scope of the investigation. The original 2 male burglars theory didn't hold up anymore. Detectives started asking, which women had a motive to kill Sherry Rasmussen? It wasn't a long list. Stephanie Lazarus's name came up again, and this time no one was brushing it off. By 2009, the cold case team had a plan. They began discreetly tailing Lazarus, who was still working at LAPD's art theft unit. The goal, get a sample of her DNA without tipping her off. The opportunity came when she went shopping at a Costco. After she left, detectives retrieved a cup and straw she had tossed in the trash. Tests confirmed it was her DNA, a match to the bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's body.
23 years after the murder, the case had finally cracked wide open.
So they came up with a plan: lure her into a controlled environment where she wouldn't be armed. In June 2009, two detectives asked Lazarus to come to an interview room under the pretense of helping with an investigation involving stolen art. What Lazarus didn't know was that the room was wired for audio and video. The conversation started casually, but when the detectives began asking about her history with John Ruetten and her memories of Sherry Rasmussen, her tone changed. She got defensive and nervous. She insisted she had only briefly dated John in college, that she barely knew Sherry, and that any suggestion otherwise was crazy. But her answers were riddled with inconsistencies. Finally, when it became clear that she wasn't going to admit anything, the detectives stepped out, and SWAT came in. Lazarus was handcuffed in her own police station. The image was surreal: a veteran LAPD detective, still in professional attire, being led away for a 23-year murder. The prosecution's case against Stephanie Lazarus was both simple and devastating. Motive: a long-standing obsession with John Ruetten and jealousy of his wife. Evidence: a bite mark containing her DNA, consistent with a struggle during the murder. Behavior: threats made to Sherry before her death, and her immediate defensiveness when questioned decades later. The defense tried to poke holes in the case. They argued that the investigation was flawed, that evidence could have been contaminated over the years, and that the bite mark wasn't conclusive proof she committed the murder. But the jury didn't buy it. John Ruetten testified, visibly shaken, about his history with Lazarus. Sherry's parents described the warning their daughter had received, and the forensic evidence, especially the DNA, was damning. In March 2012, Stephanie Lazarus was found guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. For the Rasmussen family, it was a bittersweet victory. They finally had justice, but it had taken over 2 decades and only happened because evidence had survived in a freezer long enough for science to catch up. Lazarus was sent to the California Institution for Women in Chino. From the moment she entered prison, she maintained her innocence. She's never admitted to killing Sherry Rasmussen, and she's never expressed remorse. For someone used to carrying a badge, the transition to life in an orange jumpsuit was stark. She went from being a respected detective with her own office to an inmate number in a system she once helped enforce. Other prisoners knew who she was, and not in a friendly way. A cop in prison is never a good position to be in. Still, Lazarus managed to keep a low profile. She stayed out of trouble, took classes, and kept her head down. In February 2025, at age 64, Stephanie Lazarus faced the parole board for the second time. Her first attempt, in 2022, had been denied because she refused to take responsibility for the crime. This time, nothing had changed. The board noted that she continued to downplay her relationship with John Ruetten and gave inconsistent accounts of where she was the day of the murder. She spoke about moving on from the past, but never once acknowledged Sherry Rasmussen's name. For parole boards, remorse and accountability matter. Lazarus offered neither. Sherry's sister and father attended the hearing, urging the board to keep Lazarus locked up. They reminded everyone that this wasn't just about a love triangle. It was about the calculated, violent murder of a young woman in her own home. After deliberating, the board denied her parole again. She won't be eligible for another hearing until 2028, when she'll be 67 years old. The Stephanie Lazarus case is a chilling reminder that killers can hide in plain sight, even behind a badge. For over 20 years, she attended police functions, investigated thefts, and walked the same halls as the detectives who had failed to catch her. All while the family of Sherry Rasmussen begged for someone to listen. In the end, it wasn't a confession, a witness, or a sudden slip-up that brought her down. It was science, patience, and the determination of a family who refused to forget. And for Lazarus, the life she once had, the career, the freedom, the image of respectability, is gone forever.